Here's some help with naming covalent compounds. So the periodic table is divided into two parts by a sort of zigzag line on the right side. Everything to the left of that is a metal, and everything to the right of that is a non-metal. A covalent compound is when two non-metals combine. So if we take one non-metal and mix it with another non-metal, we're going to get a covalent compound. So let's try naming some of the covalent compounds listed here. The one difference, for the unique thing about naming covalent compounds, is we're going to give a prefix that in front of each element that represents the subscript that comes after it. So for example, let's try naming P4S3. So first, phosphorus is to the right of that zigzag line, sulfur is to the right of that zigzag line, so we have a covalent compound. To name a covalent compound, take the first element, here P, that's phosphorus, name that exactly as it is in the periodic table, so phosphorus. For the second element, here S, take just the first syllable, so the first syllable of sulfur is sulf, and write that down. Now, to show that those two elements are combining together, add the ending IDE to the end of the second element. Now, for covalent compounds, we still have to put prefixes in to say how many of each element we have. So, the subscript after phosphorus is 4. The prefix that corresponds to 4 is tetra, so we're going to put the prefix tetra in front of phosphorus. So tetraphosphorus. The subscript that comes after S is 3. The prefix that corresponds to 3 is tri, so we're going to put the prefix tri in front of the sulfide. So the full name for P4S3 would be tetraphosphorus trisulfide. So if you take the phosphorus, which is the red stuff at the end of the match, and you combine it in just the right way with sulfur, you'll get tetraphosphorus trisulfide. How about this, N2O4? So first, nitrogen is to the right of that zigzag line, oxygen is to the right of that zigzag line, so we're dealing with two nonmetals, so we have a covalent compound. To name a covalent compound, take the first element, here that's N, nitrogen, and name it exactly as it is on the periodic table, so nitrogen. For the second element, take just the first syllable, so O is oxygen, the first syllable of that is ox, and add the ending IDE to show that these two elements are sticking together in a compound. So now we have nitrogen oxide, but we still have to add prefixes because it's a covalent compound to show how many of each type of atom we have. So for the nitrogen, the subscript that comes after the N is 2. The prefix that corresponds to the subscript 2 is di. So we're going to put di in front of the word nitrogen. The number that comes after that comes after oxygen is 4, and the prefix that corresponds to 4 is tetra. So we're going to put tetra in front of oxide. And the name for N2O4 would be dinitrogen tetraoxide. Sometimes, to avoid the awkward two vowels coming right after each other, people will just eliminate this A. So it'd be dinitrogen tetroxide. But either way is technically correct. So if you take nitrogen and you mix it together with oxygen in just the right way, you'll get this clear gas, dinitrogen tetroxide. What's the name of P2O5? First, phosphorus is to the right of that zigzag line, oxygen is to the right of that zigzag line, so we're dealing with two nonmetals. If you mix two nonmetals together, then it's a covalent compound. To name a covalent compound, take the name of the first element and name it exactly as it is on the periodic table. So here P is phosphorus, and we'll name that just by saying phosphorus. For the second element, take just the first syllable. So O is oxygen, the first syllable of that is ox. To show that those two elements are combining in a compound, add the ending IDE to that ox. So so far we have phosphorus oxide. Because it's a covalent compound, we have to add prefixes to say how many of each element we have. So the number that comes after P, the subscript for P, is 2. And the prefix that corresponds to that subscript is di. So I'm going to put the prefix di in front of phosphorus. The number that comes after O, the subscript for O, is 5. And the prefix that corresponds to 5 is penta. So I'm going to put the prefix penta in front of oxide. And the full name for P2O5 would be diphosphorus pentaoxide. So if you take phosphorus and you mix it together with oxygen in just the right way, you would get diphosphorus pentoxide. What would be the name of CO2? So C is to the right of that zigzag line on the periodic table. O is also to the right. If you're to the right of that zigzag line, then you're a nonmetal. So here we have two nonmetals, and so we have a covalent compound. To name a covalent compound, take the first element and name it exactly as it is on the periodic table. So C is carbon, and so we'll name that just as carbon. For the second element, take just the first syllable. So O is oxygen, the first syllable of oxygen is ox. To show that those two elements are combining, add the ending "ide." So far we have carbon oxide. Because it's a covalent compound, we have to add prefixes to show how many of each element we have. Now, the number at the bottom of carbon is 1. There's no number written there, so the number is 1. And the prefix that corresponds to the subscript 1 is mono. So you would think that we would put that prefix in front of carbon and we'd have monocarbon. But this is the one exception for covalent naming. You don't use the prefix mono in front of the first element. You would use the prefix mono in front of the second element if it were appropriate there, but you never use the prefix mono in front of just the first element. So because it would be a mono, we're not going to write anything there. For oxygen, the number that comes after the oxygen is 2, and the prefix that corresponds to that is di. So we're going to put the prefix di in front of oxide. And so the name of CO2 is carbon dioxide. It's dry ice, and it is also what you are exhaling right now. So if you take carbon and you mix it together with oxygen in just the right way, you'll get carbon dioxide. How about SF6? SF6 is a clear gas, but it's very, very heavy. So what they've done here is they've poured the clear gas into a fish tank, and it sinks to the bottom. But we can't see it, it's clear. So what we can do is we can take a little boat and put it on top, and it floats just like it would in water. So what's the name of SF6? So first, S is to the right of that zigzag line. F is also to the right, so they're both nonmetals. If you have two nonmetals, then what you're dealing with is a covalent compound. To name a covalent compound, take the first element and name it exactly as it is on the periodic table. So S is sulfur. For the second element, take just the first syllable. So F is fluorine. The first syllable of that is fluor. Then, to show that these two elements are combining together to make a compound, add the ending IDE. So ide. So far we have sulfur fluoride. Because this is a covalent compound, we have to include prefixes to show how many of each element we're dealing with. So the subscript that comes after S is 1. No number is written there, and when no number is written, the subscript is 1. The prefix that corresponds to the subscript 1 is mono, so you would think we would include the prefix mono in front of sulfur. But remember this one exception. You never include the prefix mono in front of the first element. So because it would be mono, we're just not going to put anything in front of that first element. For F, we have 6. So the subscript is 6, and the prefix that corresponds to 6 is hexa. So we're going to put the prefix hexa in front of fluoride. And the name for SF6 would be sulfur hexafluoride. So if you take sulfur and you combine it with fluorine in just the right way, you would get sulfur hexafluoride. Thanks so much for your attention.